Okay, good afternoon, everyone. What we wanted to do today is something which often doesn't happen, which is a debate between academia and practice. Often in academia, we get accused of being, well, not really knowing what we're talking about in the real world. And sometimes the real world people get accused of being veterans of a 20-year campaign. Anyway, we thought we'd have a series of questions today. And Matt is going to comment on some of these questions about purpose. Then I'm going to give a little bit of an academic view on the same question. And then we'll open it up to debate. Okay, so our first question is, what is the process by which we can go about defining an organizational purpose? So Matt, we're going to kick off with you.
Yeah, it's a bit of context. So for those of you who don't know, I was at Vodafone Group as Corporate Affairs Director for 7 years, BG Group before that, and various companies before that. So I have spent quite a long time in rooms, as many of you have, grappling with these kind of issues in hard-headed terms. So I think the first thing for me is that corporate purpose is defined as much as anything by risk. When companies think about what are the factors that could destroy their business in the future, increasingly societal risk is at the top of the list. And if you look at the table of principal risks at the back of the annual report, which should be required reading for anyone who's interested in any company, more and more you will see essentially political risk and societal risk moving up that index, as it were. And a sense of social purpose, a sense of a company operating in a way that builds relationships within wider society is essentially risk mitigation. And that, in my experience, is where many of these conversations start. It's not a sort of starry-eyed sense of we need to do the right thing in the world. It's how do we cope with a world of increasing populism, of less informed politics, of fractured, polarized, and increasingly angry publics, and do so in a way that's authentic, to pick up on a word from previous presentations.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, so from my point of view, I think what's interesting as a psychologist, and Sandra mentioned that's my background, I was very interested in looking at purpose from a psychological point of view. And for the last 8 years or so, we've done a lot of work with our neuroscience department at the University of Reading. And one of the things that's come out very strongly from our work with the neuroscience team is that human beings are systems of conflict. So we're all conflicted, and within us, we have conflicting purposes. And I think for me, that was, when I first started to realize that was really liberating, because I know that Paul at the end said we have to be authentic. If we're not careful, being authentic is something that we'll have to pretend to be. So starting off, I'm really glad, Matt picks up on this idea that actually, that purpose is conflicted. It is about risk. And I think I throw up these 4 key drives. I mean, this is a lovely piece of work based on some neuroscientists from University of Harvard. Nitin Noria is actually the Dean of Harvard Business School. Essentially, they found that human beings seem to have 4 key drivers. We have the drive to acquire money and status, and you can see that at the core of a lot of what businesses do. We also have the drive to bond, to build relationships with others. We have the drive to comprehend, which is, with Paul, again, he spoke a lot about innovation, but human beings are the learning animal. If you throw a ball for a dog, the dog will chase the ball. You throw a ball for a human being, the human being will ask you, why do you throw the ball at me? We have this need for meaning. And finally, this final drive, which is the drive to defend, which is very much related to all of the other drives. It's about protecting what we might own. It's about protecting the relationships we have. It's about protecting the knowledge that we have. So for me, if we think about purpose, we can have purpose in relation to all of these 4 things. And what's really interesting, I think, again, about the world of neuroscience is that, in some ways, these drives are similar to Maslow, aren't they? But Maslow's hierarchy, even though I think it's a great theory, in many ways it's also quite an insulting theory, because you've got people, your Gandhis or Mandelas of the world, who had all the food and they could want, but actually they were fighting for something greater than what their personal circumstances allowed them to. So for me, I think if we think about this and the evidence from personal psychology, we know that when individuals get out of balance, they start to lead deeply destructive lives. So I don't know, we had a hand up earlier for some cartoon show. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, most people have seen that. That very much is, if you like, the drive to acquire gone crazy. okay, chasing this drive to acquire at the expense of the other drives. So for us, from a psychological and academic point of view, when we think about purpose, we think about purpose not just in relation to each of these drives, but purpose in relation to the balance between them, or critically, the imbalance between them. The evidence is very strong. Wolf of Wall Street is a great movie, and it shows that, if you want to be satisfied and you're caught up in the drive to acquire, you're never going to be satisfied by acquiring more things. You're just going to carry on wanting to acquire more and more. The only way to be satisfied is to balance. And so for me, when we thought about this, it really is about reflecting on balance and imbalance, and then recognizing that actually organizations and businesses operate in a world that is also imbalanced. Okay, so my background, I'm a South African by origin, and I think of my upbringing, growing up in apartheid South Africa, that was a society which had been completely skewed towards the drive to defend. I'm a white South African. I was brought up to be scared of people I had no reason to be scared of. We were living in a society which was focused primarily on driving to defend something against an enemy that didn't really exist. So there are dangers when things get out of balance. And I think if I think about the processes that companies could go through, organizations could go through in defining their purpose, it's about reflecting on what are their strengths and weaknesses, and critically, how are they helping society to achieve balance and not imbalance. So if you think of the world of business, as I said before, the drive to acquire, I think, has become dominant because we can buy and sell things. The drive to bond has become something which is very, very popular with the rise of the internet and everything else. But actually, the key thing to me in all of this is to rethink about where a business relates to society, and what is the role that business is playing in terms of achieving and helping to redress balance in society. And I think if you look at the world we live in today in relation to politics in particular, you can start to see a rise, I think, in the dominance of the drive to defend with Trump, with Brexit. And then the thought is, how can business relate its purpose to something which balances that out? So for me, this is a lens which I think is very, very human, which allows us to think of purpose in fundamentally human terms. So to me, the debate today has been very interesting in terms of the advent of technology. Technology is changing hugely quickly. As human beings, we're a fundamentally old piece of kit. We're not changing that much. We've got the same drives that we've had for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So thinking about how we use them in relation to the world, and how businesses can define their purpose by reflecting on these different drives and the balance of them in society, I think becomes something which is critical. I don't know, Matt, if you want to comment on that at all.
No, I agree. Look, I mean, many of you in this room will know that large businesses in particular are full of people who think very deeply about this and are very worried about it, and are trying to understand what is the place that their business needs to get to in order to move them from where they are now, which is profoundly distrusted. And I agree with what Ian was saying earlier, that that's not a new thing, but it's a more toxic environment now to be in a business that's distrusted than I think would have been the case 30, 40 years ago, to a place where your employees, your future talent, the civil society stakeholders around you, who will determine whether or not you have a social license to operate or a literal license to operate, think you're a good thing. How a business moves from being distrusted to genuinely part of the fabric of society in a meaningful way is something that worries a great deal of people, a large number of people in business, in my experience. And actually, it's not clear to many people in business how to do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The social purpose movement, and I think it is a movement, and the Better Blueprint for Business is an example of that, has sort of taken hold because companies are struggling to understand how they can shape themselves genuinely, strategically, in terms of their financial and their commercial objectives. This is not CSR, for the avoidance of doubt. This is not just a new name for an old thing. It's about reinventing your business in a way that positions them for long-term sustainable growth at the heart of the societies that they serve. And the recipe isn't clear to people. There are some companies who are much more advanced than others. Unilever is an obvious case in point. But there are many other companies who are not there, but are trying to understand how to get there.
So, I mean, that leads us, I think, to the next question, which, I think we'll reflect on the end, is what are the benefits of having a corporate purpose, Matt? What, in your experience? And have you got any stories you can tell us on that?
Yeah, so I think back to my earlier point, the most important benefit is about risk. If you have a clearly articulated purpose that resonates with all of the publics that will define in the long term whether or not you have a business, you are better insulated against the future than you don't. And that, I think, is a very strong drive of the conversation, certainly that I've been involved in my time at Vodafone. So I'll give you a couple of practical examples from Vodafone where my team and I created a new sustainable business framework and took it to the board and then implemented it in the business over the last 4 years. And that was we zeroed in on 2 areas of significant public concern about our business and about our industry, and decided that we wanted to own those areas of concern and, as it were, reverse them and make them positive attributes in terms of what we did. So one area was around women, another area is around energy use, and I'll very briefly explain both of those. So 70% of all consumer purchasing decisions in the world are made by women. Yeah? And the mobile phone industry particularly, and in emerging markets in particular, a significant proportion of the under-penetrated market in emerging markets is female. So it's a significant commercial opportunity for the business. At the same time, this is a technology industry that is dominated by men. The decisions are made by men, the workforce is predominantly male, the thinking is predominantly male. So the company basically put together the opportunity and, as it were, the societal risk, and made a decision to have an ambition. And the ambition is that by 2025, Vodafone will be the world's best employer for women. And it was a conscious bit of language that my team and I came up with, presented to the board and the ExCo and the organisation, and said, we should do this. And the organisation is now setting about doing a whole bunch of different things, including the world's first global maternity policy, the world's largest leavers program for women coming back to work after taking up to 10 years out of having kids, and a whole range of commercial programs that are targeted at the poorest women in the world who rationally no other mobile operator would serve. All of those things, together with a bunch of other stuff, essentially does 2 things. First of all, it positions the company as being genuinely on the side of half the world's population and thinking about the issues that half the world's population have to deal with. And secondly, half the world's population is a significant growth opportunity. It's revenue, it's money. The lesson from that, by the way, is go with the grain of the business. If you want to bring about social change within a business, if you want to create a true social purpose, you can't do it by, as it were, knocking on the door saying, it's time to be good now. Yeah? You carry on making money, but you need to be good as well. You need to be good from making money. So going with the grain of the business, understanding where the business actually intrinsically in itself is a social good, and amplifying that is part of the secret. Second very brief example is energy. The information communications technology sector uses unbelievable amounts of power. This is not something many people realize, but actually the CO2 footprint is larger than aviation. When Facebook opened a new server farm in Sweden, the Swedish government was astonished to discover that that one data center consumed more electricity than the entire Swedish steel industry. It's a very, very energy-intensive business that historically has not really thought that hard about energy. And I went to my colleagues at Vodafone and I said, here's the problem. We are going to be where aviation is today, with people super gluing their ears to runways. Yeah, that's what's going to happen to us unless we own this. And by the way, because of political risk, because of carbon pricing and a whole bunch of other factors, my team have modeled what happens to the cost of electricity, which is a major input cost in a low-margin company. And did you know that 8 years from now, it's 5 times what you thought it was? So we've just evaporated all of the free cash flow that you think you're going to have 5 years out on the electricity bill, and you didn't even know it was an issue, which got, to put it mildly, their undivided attention. And we then said, so we have an answer, and the answer is to move to 100% renewables and decarbonize the company. Basically, you do something that's what you should do as a social citizen, that also materially reduces by hundreds of millions of euros a year your operating cost. That's what I mean about going with the grain of the business. If we knocked on the door and said, we want to talk to you about how you can play a role in preventing the planet from turning into something from Mad Max for your grandchildren, they would listen politely, but we wouldn't have got the same outcome. It's about using financial power to make a financial argument that is ultimately a social argument.
I mean, what I love about those two examples is it's, defining purpose in relation to what's happening in society, but actually acknowledging the power of both of those drives, the drive to defend the world, but also the drive and the need to acquire money and status. So I'm going to just pick up on some of those things in a much more boring way. The academic has the slides, which Matt's got the stories. But I mean, I think for me, and hats off to Alistair Green and Bjorn Edlund. Bjorn would have loved to have been here today. Alistair, myself, and Bjorn did some research on the impact of purpose in organizations. And I guess one of the key things that having a purpose does is it defines and helps define strategy proactively, but critically, it helps define what an organization does and doesn't do. So in many ways, it links very strongly to the work, and the words that I've heard today, the chairman of Rolls-Royce was talking about values. In many ways, purpose is similar and in line with the values. It helps to define what you should and critically what you shouldn't do. I think the other thing, which, and this is a nod to Sandra and the ECHO team as well, a number of years ago we did some work with Zurich Insurance, helping them to measure their purpose and whether or not they were delivering a purpose with different stakeholders, from employees through to customers, through to employee prospects. And what was very powerful there is, through that research, we were able to track and causally link the, stakeholders who are believing in the purpose of the organization are also those who are more committed, are also those who are likely to join the organization. So there is a way in which you can, if you like, link together the organization's purpose with positive stakeholder support. And I think that's where I think you can start to be strategic and research and data-driven in this aspect, because clearly a purpose needs to be driven from within, but it also needs to drive stakeholder support. So I guess our last question, just to reflect on Matt, is, so we've spoken about purpose being a good thing, but, is purpose ever a bad thing? Is purpose ever something that we should be careful of? Is purpose something which, in a corporate sense, have you seen examples where purpose has been counterproductive?
Well, it's definitely counterproductive if it's fake. I mean, it's not CSR, folks, right? This is not the kind of what I call the greenwash offset. Over here we're doing stuff that makes us look nice, and over here we're actually making money. I mean, there's an old joke that I tell about the oil industry that usually used to irritate people in the oil industry, but CSR is a little bit like going to the people of a village and saying, yes, we chopped down your ancient forest, but don't worry, we use the logs to build you a youth club. Yeah? It just doesn't work anymore. So if it's an adjunct, it's a failure. It has to be central to the business's genuine commercial, operational, strategic intent. Making more money by doing good and doing good by making more money. So the number one danger is that it effectively gets delegated. And what I've seen in a number of companies is that it gets delegated, in a sense, to two different directions, neither of which is helpful. One is delegated to the people who own reputation, and the inverted commas are, that's the corporate affairs team. It's about, make the NGOs happy, make all those activists go away. Look, we've got a purpose, aren't we great? And the other, even more dangerous direction is that it goes to the marketing team, and you end up with what people call brand with purpose. Right? It's happy clappy videos. And it's not persuasive. More to the point, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Businesses have to be authentic in order to be sustainable. And sustainability, true sustainability, is about authenticity. So the first mistake is not understanding what it is. I think the second danger that I've seen, not in my own company, I would say, though there were moments where this was a risk, but I've seen it in other companies, is there's a whole bunch of processes that companies can go through to define their purpose, that they do so sort of genuinely and with the best possible intent, well, they end up in the wrong place because they don't ask enough people and they don't think holistically enough about the risks. So, two very brief examples, not of companies, but of areas of error. One is just groupthink, simple corporate groupthink. No disrespect to all of us in this room, but half of us know each other. We're all in the village, we're all in the bubble, right? This is not the real world. We sort of know that. And yet, how many, as it were, consultations, stakeholder engagements essentially happen within this room? It's a groupthink thing. It's why so many people in business were surprised by Brexit. Yeah, because so many people in business live in London. Right? I don't live in London. I live in a place where, I was the only gay in the village. I was the only Remain voter in the village. I sort of knew. So getting outside the metropolitan bubble, breaking outside groupthink, in order to understand, no, truly, what is it about our business that people are afraid of? Because that's where you need to be, dare I say it, a banned word, but transparent, truly, truly transparent. And what are the aspirations of society that reflect directly on our business, where our business can make a material difference? That's where your social purpose lies. But to do that, you've really got to step outside the bubble. So that's the first area of error. The second is human rights. So one of my big areas of focus is human rights. I ran the global human rights program at Vodafone. Very, very few businesses, in my experience, genuinely understand the international human rights dimension and their role within it. And they don't look at their aspirations, their business objectives, and the things that can go wrong through a human rights lens. Or if they do, they look at it through a narrow human rights lens. Classic example in my business is one of the big areas of human rights for a company like Vodafone is data protection and privacy, the individual's rights to privacy. If you lose the customer's trust that you'll keep their communications private, your business dies overnight. A bit like BP and safety, or oil industry and gas industry and safety. Privacy is like safety is to the oil and gas industry. So yes, absolutely, we ran what is now considered to be the world's largest digital human rights program, but nobody in the business really was thinking about physical human rights, about labor conditions in the supply chain. 250,000 people making all these bits of kit that were being sold on to or used in the service of 500 million customers worldwide. And I've said to many people in telecoms and technology, this is a sector that has never had a Rana Plaza that the apparel industry had. And the sector as a whole, Foxconn and Apple is another example, had a huge blind spot, still has a huge blind spot about the physical human rights risks inherent to its supply chain. So not being holistic enough in understanding all the stuff out there that you could be perceived as being absolutely complicit in causing to go wrong is another area of risk.
Thanks, but I can see from Sandra moving towards us that we've run out of time. So, I mean, for me, I guess the last thing I wanted to say on the subject is I think the key risk for me is that purpose can be divisive. And we live in a world where getting 51% of the votes is enough to get power, which means we can make 49% of the people unhappy. So the key thing for me here is to think about purpose in those contexts and think about how we can develop an inclusive purpose that balances drives and, keeps more than 51% of people happy.